Can you please take your seats? Proceedings will start shortly. Can I just remind you to stay silent and seated until the chair has left the room? Thank you.
Good. All right, Professor, ready to go again?
Yes.
Good, thank you. Yes, Ms. Green.
Yes, thank you. I just want to return to one aspect of your evidence this morning, and then I'll pick up where we left off on vertical plane spread. So you said that for this type of high-rise building, compartmentation is critical, yes?
Yes.
Do you mean a high-rise building with a stay-put strategy?
Well, it will be even more critical with a stay-put strategy. And, but it also applies to buildings with stage egress and simultaneous evacuation.
Yeah. And you agreed with me that once compartmentation is breached, evacuation becomes the preferred option, yes?
When vertical compartmentation, yes, when the fire starts spreading beyond the floor of origin.
Would you agree that once compartmentation is breached, evacuation is necessary to secure the fire safety of those in the building?
Yes.
And is it the only viable option at that point?
Yep.
So I just want to return to the importance of the PIR insulation. We were just talking about it before the break. And just to be clear, just to kind of remind ourselves, there was PIR insulation behind the spandrel panels, the ACM panels, in 2 layers of 80 millimetres, and also a single layer of 100 millimetres on the columns. And also there was some, and that was Celotex RS5000 PIR insulation. There was some Kingspan K15 phenolic foam boards also used on some of the spandrels, although that's possibly only about 7% of the total insulation. So just to be clear what we're talking about here.
Yes.
As we've discussed, PIR has a low thermal inertia, and you've agreed that that means a low time to ignition. You've also said that the PIR is liable to char.
Yes.
Can you explain what impact those features of the PIR, i.e. low thermal inertia and propensity to char, have on flame spread?
Yes. The low thermal inertia results in very little energy required to ignite the material. All the energy gets stuck very close to the surface. So with very little energy, you can bring the surface to a temperature of ignition and it starts burning. Now, when a charring material starts degrading and burning, it produces a layer of carbon that effectively starts protecting the material behind. So as opposed to a non-charring material that will burn completely, this material will burn only a fraction, and the layer that is produced prevents the heat from burning any further. So you need to have some heat from the outside to help it burn. The moment you remove the heat from the outside, it tends to extinguish on its own, because effectively no heat can get from the flame to the fuel to keep evaporating the fuel. So the charring has one fundamental outcome, is that it will reduce the fraction of the mass of the material that is actually going to burn and leave this big residue of carbon. And that big residue of carbon is going to eventually lead to extinguishment of the material itself. So it's going to stop burning on its own.
Yeah. And you've explained in your report, you say that the features of the PIR give rise to the potential to burn for a much longer time period. Again, first of all, what data or other information have you relied upon when you say that the PIR has the potential to burn for longer periods?
Well, this is relative, and the reason why it's relative is because the duration of burning is a function of the total mass that burns. So if you have a certain thickness of PIR, that will give you a certain amount of mass, and that certain amount of mass will determine how long it's going to burn. Now, obviously, the mass that you're considering is the fraction that burns, not the fraction that remains as char. So when you compare the amount of mass that you have of PIR compared to other combustible materials like polyethylene or the EDPM, the mass of PIR is more significant, and therefore it has a propensity to remain burning for a fairly long period of time relative to the other materials.
Yeah. And can you just explain your view about the interaction that we may have got on the building between the ACP panels and the PIR insulation? You talk, for example, about radiative feedback. Can you just explain what radiative feedback is between those two?
As I mentioned, the PIR by itself, it will self-extinguish. So effectively the char layer forms, and unless you put an external heat to try to keep the burning going, it will just fade out and die. So when you have the polyethylene burning in front, that polyethylene provides that extra source of heat. That's what we call radiative feedback. So between the two of them, they are supporting each other. And so what we see in the images of the burning of the tower, it's quite complex in the sense that there's different forms of behavior. There's certain areas where you have fairly intense burning, where that radiative feedback is having both materials burning quite significantly. But then later on, when you see that the PE has disappeared, then you will have self-extinction of the PIR, and you get residue of unburned PIR left behind. So eventually you'll get multiple forms of interaction, and the question if it's going to continue burning or not continue burning, it's a question of how the two of them are interacting in every particular location.
So how does the PIR affect the rate at which the aluminium composite panels burn?
That is a very difficult question to answer, but I believe that it is likely that the PIR will have a minor effect on the rate of burning, because the polyethylene being thermally thin, once it ignites and it starts spreading, it will spread at a much faster rate than the PIR. So the support that the PIR can provide to the rate of spread is probably of secondary importance.
Okay. And why does the fact that they're going to burn out at different stages matter in terms of the development of this fire?
Because one determines the rate at which it spreads, the other determines how long it's going to be burning. And so while the second one is still burning, dripping and all sorts of other potential interaction that can happen between the two of them can extend the duration of burning at any localized space. So effectively it's that interaction that one is determining the speed at which it's propagating, the other one is basically keeping that area burning.
Yeah. Just briefly, because we'll get into testing in much more detail at phase 2, but Professor Bisbee has drawn attention to the DCLG tests after Grenfell, which compared PIR with mineral wool insulation, but using otherwise similar materials to Grenfell. Do you agree that a complex but different interaction will also apply to a system incorporating a mineral fibre insulation and a PE called ACM?
Yes, there will be a different interaction because the mineral material will not burn by itself, and but nevertheless it still has the capacity of insulating. In other words, it can support the continuous burning of the ACM, and also it can absorb dripping fuel, and it can serve as a wick, to keep things burning. So there will be other forms of interactions that the mineral wool will have with the ACM that could potentially lead to no difference or a significant difference depending on the characteristics of the assembly.
And would you say that the current evidence is inconclusive on the precise role played by the presence of the PIR at Grenfell, and that further testing would be helpful?
Yes, I think that while it is clear that some level of interaction exists, it is not really clear exactly what is the level of interaction that is occurring, and it's actually even less clear what would have been the outcome in the absence of one or the other. I think the testing evidence, the standard testing evidence that exists right now, the particular tests that are being conducted, and this BASF 414, is a test that in many ways doesn't give enough detail to be able to come up to any real conclusions, doesn't have adequate instrumentation, and the scenario is a scenario that doesn't really honor the complexity of the system.
So in terms of those DCLG tests after Grenfell using the mineral wool insulation, what significance do you place on those the results of those tests?
I would say very little.
You've said it's very difficult to quantify the impact that the PIR insulation have. At this stage, in terms of your preliminary view, can you give an overall view as to whether you think it had a contribution, and if so, broadly in what respect?
I mean, it clearly did have a contribution, but I will not be able to say what kind of a contribution it had, if it was very significant or mildly significant. But clearly there is burning of the PIR, and there's evidence that it's been contributing to the energy that is being released. But quantify that to the extent of being able to say how important that was is still not very clear.
In terms of the state of the building after the fire, would you attach any significance to any areas where, despite extensive charring of the insulation, the ACM remains intact? Does that tell us anything?
Not really. I mean, once again, it is one of those situations where the complexity of the interactions is such that there might have been a convergence of different things that effectively led to an area where the insulation burned first, and then the ACM never caught fire. So that is a possibility. A very good example will be areas that were wetted by the firefighters, for example.
Right. Yeah. So I was going to ask you. So, for example, on level 3, it's been suggested that there were some areas where there was deep, widespread charring to the insulation, but where damage to the ACM panels were much more minor, insignificant. That's level 3. Does that tell you anything?
So I mean, the only thing that I could probably conclude from that is that there was some element of cooling going on, and that would have, the cooling wouldn't get to the insulation, so the insulation might have still been burning through the cavity, while the external part of the ACM was being protected by the water from the firefighters.
What about any evidence on the corner columns where there might have been soot deposition at the joints of the panels, suggesting that the fire was burning behind the panels rather than on the exterior? Does that have any significance in terms of the contribution of the two materials?
Well, it's significant in the sense that it actually does show that the PIR, at least to a certain extent, can actually burn in the absence of the ACM. Now, the real question is, I mean, you might have soot deposition after the fact, but that could have just simply be from a very, very short period of burning. Yeah. So the PR could have extinguished very rapidly, and we would have not been able to tell that unless, we did a very systematic analysis of cross sections to see the charring thickness.
Do you think it would be helpful or indeed practicable to do a survey of the insulation to try and work out what remained after the fire versus what remained of the ACM or other components? Do you think that would be a helpful exercise?
I do believe so, because in many ways the interactions between the two materials or the two systems are relatively unknown, and it will be very important to be able to establish if one can burn without the other one, and to what extent that can happen. And all those details can only be done with a very detailed and general survey of the remnants of the insulation.
And is that something you think could be done at phase 2 based on the existing evidence?
Well, I mean, I think if the insulation was available and properly catalogued, yes, that's something that could be done. Yeah.
Just going back to the other international fires that we looked at earlier, the Dubai fires, the Lacrosse fire in Australia, did those other fires involve PE cord ACM panels?
That's difficult to know. I think that unfortunately the information that is available in most of these fires is generally quite inaccurate, most of it coming from the media. There are reports and all the details on the one that is well investigated is the Docklands fire, and there's details of all the materials in there, and the report is publicly available.
Is that the same as the Lacrosse fire?
That's the Lacrosse fire. Yeah. So I wouldn't be able to say on the top of my head exactly what was the insulation material, but we reviewed all those, but it was difficult to establish any kind of correlation between them, because one of the terrible things about most of these incidents is that they were very poorly investigated, and none of the information was ever made public. So it's very difficult, to come up with a good correlation of what was in each of these events.
So do you know whether any of them featured mineral fibre insulation as opposed to, for example, a PIR type insulation?
I wouldn't know.
Let's move on then. I want to ask you some questions about the white window infill panels for a moment, just again to orientate ourselves as to what we're talking about. Can we just look at a figure in your report, figure 24, that's JTOS 601 at page 62. Yes, and if we can focus on figure 24 at the top of that, it's the right-hand image. Sorry, the right hand, not the left hand. So the white infill panels we're talking about are the ones that we can see down on the bottom right-hand side, is that right? That are in between the windows in each of the flats. These were extruded polystyrene, is that your understanding?
Yes.
Often referred to as XPS, extruded polystyrene?
Yes.
And Dr. Lane has estimated in her report that these panels made up approximately 13% of the external surface between levels 4 and 23. Again, is that consistent with your understanding? Yes. Professor Bisbee has set out the properties of XPS in his report, that it has a melting temperature of 230 degrees C compared to, for example, 130 degrees C of PE. Is that correct?
Yes.
And there's no figure given for thermal inertia, it just says that they melt. Is that right?
Yes, they tend to melt. They generally have a very low thermal inertia.
Do you think that these white window infill panels could have played a role in terms of the vertical flame spread we saw at Grenfell Tower?
I mean, the issue with those white window infill panels is the cover. And so the nature of the cover was slightly different to the rest. Now, clearly, because they have an infill of a combustible material, they will play a role. And if it was a significant or more or less significant role, that is mostly associated on how they are protected.
When you're talking about the cover, is what you're talking about the fact that there's two skins of aluminium.
Exactly.
And then the XPS inside.
Yes.
And the aluminium skins, I think, are, is it 1.5 millimetres thick?
Yes.
Something like that. So you're saying that the fact you've got those skins on the outside affects the potential for them to contribute to vertical flame spread?
Yes, I mean, this is the basic concept of encapsulation. So when you have a combustible material that is exposed to the outside, is encapsulated. And the thickness, the characteristics of the encapsulation that you put is going to make it less or more susceptible to engage in the flame spread. Now, eventually, given the size and the nature of the fire, it is quite clear that they would have participated in the process, and how late or how early would have been determined by the capacity of the aluminum layer to protect them from the flames.
Dr. Lane has got an image in her report which she says potentially shows vertical flame spread through those alloy glazed panels. Can we just look at that? That's BLAS. Sorry, actually, before we go to this, can I just give a warning that I'm about to go to an image of the tower on fire. So if anybody's going to be distressed by that, they should leave now. We just give it another few seconds. Sorry, I should have given a warning before that last image of the burn
Well, that's
tower.
right, you've given it now. That's
Yeah.
all good.
So BLAS 5010, and then page 39, figure 10.37. Yes. Now, in fact, the corrected time for this is 1:29 a.m., not 1:26, although I don't think that matters at all. Dr. Lane has highlighted there with little blue dots where the insulating panels were on the building. This is on the east face. Do you think that that potentially shows that we are seeing some vertical flame spread across those alloy glazed panels, particularly in the higher levels of the building?
Well, we are seeing them burn, and if you look at those images, what you see is that the panels are burning while to the left. To the left of the burning has reduced. So it, just by looking at that image, and I'm not saying it's just looking at that image, I could possibly say that in this particular case, the panels were igniting, they were contributing to the burning, but the aluminum protection layer actually prevent them from being the ones driving the burning. They were just burning a little bit later than everything else. And but I think that the same way this image is there, I believe there's others where you will see slightly different processes. So it's something that I think, again, the interactions between the systems is quite complex. So in some cases you will get one side burning faster, in other cases you will get another side burning faster.
Yeah. Is it possible that one of the mechanisms by which these ignite and then melt is that you then get a pool of XPS formed at the base of the panels, which could then ignite? Is that a possible mechanism of failure?
It could potentially be, but generally XPS is a very low density material. So when it actually melts, it produces very, very little liquid fuel. So it's mostly air. So in principle, the exact density is not very clear. What was the exact density of these materials? But in principle, as a pool fire, probably the contribution will be secondary.
I see. And do you think that these panels could have contributed to the total heat release rate during the fire on the facade?
Everything would have.
Yeah.
But keep in mind that their mass is relatively small compared to everything else, so the total amount of energy they can release is actually less.
These window panels are mentioned in 3 of Dr. Lane's potential flame spread routes: horizontally across the edges, top and bottom, vertically along the sides, and then this route, which is vertically across the panels up the length of the tower. do you agree that those are potential mechanisms by which these panels could have contributed to the flame spread?
They're all clearly potential mechanisms, but given the nature of the protective aluminum plate, I would imagine that anything that is vertical will be a mechanism that we should need to consider. For this type of materials, horizontal or downward might be a very minor mechanism of spread.
Yeah. Can I just ask you briefly then, a different material, the EDPM membrane, that's the damp-proof membrane.
Yes.
That's there on the columns, between the windows and the columns. So after you've got the insulation, you've got the EDPM membrane. It's a thin black membrane, and then you're into the columns. Have you done any work to look at whether that could have contributed to vertical flame spread?
That would have contributed as all the other components. In this particular case, it's thermally thin, so this would be a material that would have spread quite rapidly. And now its particular location might not necessarily be as effective for vertical flame spread, but nevertheless is a material that will burn. Its density is not low, so it will have a significant amount of mass and it will contribute to the burning.
Mm-hmm. I now want to come on to talk about the role of cavity barriers in the facade. Can we just remind ourselves again, just to orientate ourselves, what these looked like on site? I'm going to show you just some pictures of the open state horizontal cavity barriers. If you go to an image in Dr. Lane's report, BLAS 608, page 42, figures 8.45 and 8.46. So the image at the bottom is taken from the manufacturer's literature in terms of these cavity barriers. And then at the top we see an example of the installation of one of these in one of the, I think it's underneath one of the spandrel panels here. Can you just explain in general terms what a cavity barrier is?
Yeah, I mean, when you have a cavity, and particularly if that cavity has combustible materials, there is a possibility that a chimney effect can be formed that will actually maintain spread through the cavity. The cavity barrier, in principle, is a mechanism by which you try to stop. So you close the barrier in such a way that you prevent the flames from progressing from one place, to another.
And is it right that this kind of cavity barrier has an intermittent strip that expands with heat to close the gap?
Yeah, potentially, some of the solutions that we apply is when we have intricate geometries and the cavity barrier cannot be cut exactly with the geometry of the material. You will put the strips of intumescent material. The intumescent material with heat will expand, and it will allow the cavity to close.
Now, in your report, you say that no matter how well designed or implemented, you do not think that the cavity barriers could have prevented vertical or lateral flame spread at Grenfell Tower. Is that right?
Yes.
Can you just explain why you're of that view?
A cavity barrier is a system that is designed to close a duct when you expect that your propagation is within the duct. If you put combustible materials outside the cavity barrier actually has no meaning, because effectively the burning can happen around the cavity barrier. Now, obviously, the cavity barrier will result in potentially slowing what is going on, because it will prevent part of the burning, but it is not going to stop the spread. Now, unfortunately, the cavity barriers, once they've been overcome, then melting material can actually deposit on the cavity barrier, and the cavity barrier in itself can become a mechanism of spread. So in this particular type of scenario, the fundamental principle behind why we put cavity barriers is inappropriate, because we have combustibles at both ends. So it is not blocking any path of propagation.
So is it right that you think any non-conformity of cavity barriers would not have significantly affected the rate of vertical flame spread that we saw at Grenfell Tower?
If you look at the photographs up there, what you see is that the spaces that are left open, and let's assume that those are the non-conformities, and are generally a small fraction of the overall space. Now, given the fact that the cavity barrier is already being misused by principle, I don't believe that all those nonconformities will have a very significant effect in altering the outcome.
You've talked about concerns about these barriers where you've got combustible materials potentially either side, and certainly with an ACM panel you've got it on the outside. Is it relevant that you can get deflection and warping of the aluminium panels? How does that affect the operation of the barriers?
Well, it's the same thing. If the aluminum panels warp, deform, or fall off, then the whole concept of a cavity barrier is it doesn't apply.
Professor Bisbee has said in his report that horizontal cavity barriers are considered important within rain screen cladding systems, particularly when combustible cladding and insulation products are used. Would you agree with that statement?
I think I do agree with the statement, if they are applied in a way such that they meet their objectives. So yes, of course, cavity barriers is a mechanism that we have to try to control a fire, but we do have to do it in a manner such that effectively we're delivering what we want. So for example, if I have the cavity barrier and I have the cladding sitting on top of it so that the barrier actually crosses and produces a true barrier that cannot be jumped through, then of course, then they actually are a very important aspect of the problem. I think the cavity barrier is a tool that we have to try to reduce the spread of a fire. And the tool has to be used appropriately. So if it's used appropriately and within the bounds of what we want it for, then of course it is a good tool that we can put in place.
So you think there might be circumstances in which it could work, but it would all depend on the configuration?
It's the design.
And do you think it can ever work where your combustible material is external to the barrier?
Well, then it would not be used as a cavity barrier. It would be used simply as a mechanism of trying to decelerate a process, but not necessarily under the principles of a cavity barrier, because it is not a cavity barrier anymore if it actually has combustible materials outside.
Do you think at Grenfell Tower that the cavity barriers wouldn't have been rendered as ineffective if they'd been positioned differently? So, for example, if they'd been put at the base of the panels, the spandrel panels, rather than partway up, do you think that could have affected the situation?
I think that a better design would have perfectly be possible that would have resulted in a better outcome. And I think it's difficult to say if I did this, I will get a better outcome. I think in this particular case we have to be extremely careful because, as I said before, the cavity barriers by themselves are just a tool. So they just, yes, but I do believe that if you use them appropriately and do an appropriate design, I do think that they could improve the way in which the system behaves.
What about in stabilizing the panels themselves? Is that a role they might be able to perform?
Well, I mean, you can grant them a structural role, but they're not generally designed for that purpose. And you could design them for that purpose if that's what you needed, but it is not the conventional use of a cavity barrier.
At Grenfell, what we saw was that the fixing rails for the cassettes that the cassettes were fixed to penetrated the cavity barriers, so you have these gaps. Do you think that may have played a role in terms of allowing vertical flame spread?
Look, when you start looking into all those details of the cavity barriers, the conclusion you immediately come up to is that the system that was designed could not be built correctly. So effectively you have penetrations, complex geometries, all sorts of different things that by themselves rendered any possible interpretation of them in reality very, very difficult. So, I mean, I think in this case we're talking more about taking a step back and saying this should have been designed better so that it could be implemented appropriately so that the cavity barriers could actually deliver its objective.
And do you think these gaps in these rails could have played a role in terms of either convective or conductive transfer of heat from level to level?
I mean, they would play a role. The question, once again, is to what extent that was a significant role. And that's not clear. So everything will play a role. But the significance of these elements, I think, is questionable because, again, these are relatively small gaps compared to the area that is covered. So how much a flame can actually creep compared to the flames actually burning on the outside would affect the ultimate outcome. I do think that this is probably a secondary role.
Yeah. Do you think that it would be helpful to do some further investigations to better understand the reasons for some different flame spread rates, including by reference to cavity barriers? Is that work that you think would be useful to do?
This is one of those cases where I don't believe so. I think a system that is poorly designed, it is poorly designed by definition. So taking a step back and trying to understand it in detail from a forensic perspective might help us design something better. But only in that sense, not necessarily in the sense of trying to establish if it would have affected the rate of spread. The system in itself is so complex that trying to fully understand that system, to try to correlate it to flame spread rates, is going to be extremely complex, almost, I would say, impossible to achieve. Nevertheless, doing a detailed analysis of the role of a cavity barrier so that we can actually design things better might be a very fruitful path to go.
Just pausing there and thinking about the windows. We established earlier that there were no cavity barriers around the windows. That's something that Dr. Lane and Professor Bisbee have both identified. Do you agree that cavity barriers do play a useful role around window openings to delay both breakout and re-entry?
Well, I mean, I think that is absolutely correct, and I think given the context in which we are operating, but I think you have to keep in mind that we do not protect buildings from fires exiting the building. So the concept of protecting the frame requires us understanding that we have a cavity behind that effectively is going to bring the fire back into the building. So in the context in which we are operating, absolutely, it is a fundamental problem. But in the context of design, I think we have to take a step back and first think, effectively, what are we protecting? We've never considered the idea of protecting the exit path of a fire. We always consider the problem of the re-entry path of a fire. So we have to be very careful when we state that. But I agree, given the context, it's fundamental.
Let's move now then to stage 3 of your analysis, which you say is characterised by lateral flame spread and then internal migration of smoke and fire. This is between approximately 1:30 and 2:30 a.m. And you've explained that Grenfell Tower is unusual in that horizontal spread enveloped the entirety of the building in less than 3 hours. Is that right?
Yes.
And you've also said that whilst there are multiple pathways for the fire to spread through the facade system laterally, none of them really explain the lateral propagation of the fire that we saw. Is that correct?
Yes.
Are you still of the view that there is no dominant pathway conclusively established in terms of explaining that lateral fire spread?
Well, there is one that appears as very important, which is the propagation through the crown.
Yes.
And that seems to control, through dripping and dropping of burning debris, it seems to control the rate at which it propagates. It doesn't necessarily answer the question if it would have propagated in the absence of the crown, but it does set the pace at which the propagation is occurring.
So just to be clear what you're talking about there, what you're suggesting is that the fire propagates laterally around the crown very quickly. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then you get burning and dripping PE from the crown, we'll look at its composition in a moment, down onto lower levels, which then establish their own fires, is that right?
Yes.
And then propagate upwards.
Yes.
And is that why on some of the faces we see almost a diagonal effect? You see it particularly acutely on the west face, for example.
Yes.
And you believe that the dominant mechanism is the crown melting and dripping and then lower fires making their way up?
Yes, I believe that sets the pace of the propagation. So the crown is the one that defines at what rate is propagating, and that mechanism you just described is exactly the mechanism that I believe is setting the speed at which the lateral spread is happening.
Let's just look at the crown in a bit more detail. So this is a parapet of strips of ACM, kind of C-shaped columns, or fins. Some people have described them as fins, vertical fins, which were installed right at the top of the building to hide the previous concrete parapet. Is that right?
Yes.
We can see a useful picture of that in Dr. Lane's report. This is at BLAS 5010, page 69, figure 10.73. So here we see the crown at the very top, and what we see are these vertical fins, and they are made of aluminium composite ACM panels, is that correct?
Yes.
And they're mounted on C-shaped aluminium channels that all fit into one another.
Yes.
In rows. And can you explain why you think it was that the fire spread so quickly round the crown?
I think it's primarily because as the components of the crown start burning and the polyethylene starts melting, it pulls underneath. And I mean, we did a preliminary analysis of the rate, showing a bit of this, but I think in the revised report of Dr. Bisbee, this is analyzed in much more detail, and I will concur that is probably the main mechanism, is the pulling of the polyethylene in below the elements of the crown that effectively serves as a feedback loop that accelerates the burning of these elements.
So you're talking about kind of pool fires at the bottom of these fins.
Yes.
Which then help it propagate laterally.
Yes.
And then also are dripping down, is that right?
Well, then as they're burning and they start dismembering, you're going to have dripping down and pieces falling off, and that is what effectively starts the fires in other locations.
Yeah. I mean, we'll hear.
Sorry, can I just ask, am I right in understanding that each of these fins has an exposed core along the edges?
Yes.
So it's all there waiting to propagate from one to the next?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I was about to take you to that. So Professor Bisbee has highlighted a number of characteristics which he thinks are important in terms of fire propagation around the crown. He refers to the fins as semi-continuous paths for fire to spread. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
And he's highlighted the numerous exposed ACM edges with exposed polyethylene on the edges.
Yes.
Again, do you think that's important?
Yes.
And he's also drawn attention to the fact that they are effectively C-shaped chimneys, which in themselves would support flame extension and flame spread. Do you agree with that?
Yep.
And also that there's no cavity barriers around the top of the building.
No, it's beyond that. I mean, there's not only nothing to stop it, but also as it pulls down, you have a mechanism to keep pushing it. So any gaps that you might have are being covered by the pool that is being formed underneath.
And does your view remain that the rapid internal penetration of flats above level 20 can be attributed to the presence of the crown and the debris that was falling from it?
Our analysis showed that effectively the rate at which these apartments were being penetrated effectively was pretty much the same rate as the progression of the fire in the crown.
Yeah. So those flats at the top were particularly prone to the effects of the melting, the dripping, the heating, is that correct?
Yes, yes.
But just testing the role of the crown, do you agree that in any event the fire would be more severe and of longer duration at the higher levels because of rising hot gases and flames, i.e. the flame plumes out towards the top of the building?
That is questionable because it really depends on the time that is available. So like in the case of the torch, for example, the vertical burning happens so much faster than any lateral spread that the plume never really opened it basically remained very, very narrow. Yes, of course, it opened a little bit, and you can see slightly more damage on the top than you have at the bottom, but it's truly almost a vertical plume. So in principle, it depends a lot on the capacity of the system to sustain burning to the point that you can use that energy to enhance the spread on the upper part.
So do you think that the effect that we saw around the top of the crown could simply be explained by the vertical flame pluming at the top? Is that an explanation for it?
What do you mean exactly by the effect that we...
What I'm saying is, could the lateral flame spread, the horizontal flame spread that we saw, actually be explained by the shape of the flames pluming and widening at the top of the building, rather than it being about the crown?
No.
I just want to take you to a figure in Dr. Lane's report. That's figure 10.47 in her report, BLAS 5010 at page 48. Now, this is a diagram of the crown, and just to explain, in the bottom part, what we're seeing is the top of the building with a Rainabond ACM panel which overlays some insulation which wraps around the top of the building. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then above that, Dr. Lane has marked PPC aluminium flashing over the top of the insulation. So as I understand it, that's polyester powdered coated aluminium flashing, which sat on top of the ACM and the insulation at the top of the building. And then what we see above that are these fins sitting on top of that. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Now, it's been suggested that the lateral fire spread that we see at the top of the building might have been more to do with the presence of combustible insulation at the top of the building and the Rainabond panels, rather than the fins. Would you like to comment on that?
I mean, you have combustible insulation, you have the Rainabond, and you have a platform in which you can actually pull molten polyethylene. I do not believe that there is any conclusive evidence that would show that that this is coming from the insulation, and in principle, an exposed pool fire is clearly a much more severe form of heating than any heating that could come from that insulation that is covered at all ends.
It's also said that the aluminium coping that we see over the top there, which had projected, some of it had not melted, that it had not melted across the top, but it had melted a bit on the face of it. Again, would you attach any significance to that?
Absolutely, because if you have melted polyethylene, keep in mind that the polyethylene is going to melt at a very low temperature. So the polyethylene is going to start gasifying at about 300 and something degrees, which is way below the melting temperature of aluminum. So will not let the aluminum heat up beyond that temperature until it's fully consumed. So effectively, the fact that you don't have melting of the aluminum shows that you have something else that is acting as a heat sink, that is taking the energy away and keeping it at a low temperature. It's like boiling water. You know, it will not change above 100 until you finish boiling all the water. It's exactly the same in the case of polyethylene. It will not reach the melting temperatures of aluminum. And it's quite telling, the fact that the exposed area where you don't have that molten material is the one that disappears, while all the area that is covered is the one that remains unmelted.
Yeah. Is it significant that the fins were not backed by any insulation? Does that change your view about the role of the crown?
I think in this particular case it's driven by, I believe it's driven by the pool fire, and I think that that clearly needs to be studied in a lot more detail. But I do think that under those circumstances, probably having insulation in the back would have had a very minor impact.
So let's come on to lateral flame spread at lower levels of the tower. And again, we've touched on this. So you've said that smoke plumes and heat plumes from lower down the building will widen with height and preheat other sections of the cladding, facilitating later ignition. And you've highlighted that a key mechanism for lateral flame spread further down the building is that we have burning debris falling from the areas already on fire and then accumulating on horizontal surfaces, igniting new localized fires, which then spread upwards. Is that right?
Yes.
And that's what you were talking about earlier when you said actually you think that is a real candidate to explain why the fire at Grenfell Tower spread laterally so quickly.
Yes.
Is that substantiated by the mapping out of the lateral flame spread that you've done in each direction? So in your figure 35, let's just go to that. That's JTOS 601, page 78. You have depicted the lateral spread, as I understand it, from top to bottom.
Yes.
For each face in time, is that right?
Yes.
Can you just explain how that supports the analysis that we get this debris falling down and igniting other fires that then go up?
So if you look at the top symbols, you will see as they are progressing, we're changing the shape and the color of the symbol. So basically, the bottom symbols reach the end faster. So the top symbols reach the end faster than anything else. So that will be the top of the building. So that's the progression that is driven by the crown. So then what you will see is once, for example, if you take the yellow triangle, you will see the fire reaches the yellow triangle at about 110 minutes.
So that's right in the middle of that top diagram.
Yes.
We see the yellow triangle at the top. So
Yes.
it's hit the top of the building.
Yes.
At that point. That's
So-
West 5.
Yeah, so then debris falls, it ignites the fire in the next one, which is the 120, and very rapidly it progresses up again. So you can see the three triangles. So in a period of 10 minutes, it's gone down and then all the way come up.
Yeah.
And then if you look where the next triangles are, so you will move all the way down now to about 145, and you can see that a piece of debris falls all the way down and then it creeps up. So each of those columns represents a piece of debris that landed below and then it spread it up again.
And once it's gone below and landed and then is going up vertically, do you agree with Dr. Lane that there's then a number of vertical pathways through which the fire could then spread across the facade?
Yes, I mean, you can see that there's a multiplicity of vertical pathways, and it's kind of hard to determine which one is more important than the other.
She has the columns as the first one, and then along window edges and edges of the white infill panels. Would you agree with that?
In some parts of the building, potentially that's correct. In other parts of the building, I think there might be other different mechanisms of spread. It's not very clear when you look at the progression of the fire when each mechanism dominates. And it many times depends to the proximity of the column, where the debris landed. There's a number of different factors that are going to affect what is the mechanism that dominates.
Yeah.
But I think in some areas, yes, she is correct.
Yeah. In terms of the lateral flame spread, you talked earlier about opposed flow flame spread, and Professor Bisbee explained about this in his presentation back in June with reference
Yes.
to the match and looking at the match going much slower sideways. Yes. Do you think there's any role for opposed flow flame spread in terms of what we see at Grenfell?
I think it's very minor to negligible.
Yeah. Because you think the primary mechanism is this burning debris down,
Yes.
with fires then going upwards, as opposed to it just migrating laterally across the building. Is
Yeah,
that
so
right?
if you look at the dots, for example, if you see at 50 minutes, you look at the yellow dots, you will not see progression to the right. So a little bit later, you will not see another dot appearing. The dot has to wait for the debris to come down and go up. Nowhere in the diagram you see that you have lateral progression There's very few exceptions, and there are very rare situations, many times when you have debris falling in two places. Like, for example, what happens between 130 and 140. In the top diagram, that the triangles and the squares, they seem to burn very close in time. So you could actually interpret that that was lateral spread.
Yeah.
But the reality is that it was actually two pieces of debris dropping almost at the same time, falling in places that were very close to each other and then creeping up.
Have you actually tracked that on the videos? Have you seen
Well,
that?
we've tracked it in a number of places, but it's quite difficult because tracking down where the debris lands generally is from the type of images that we have is not that precise. So we tried to emphasize in these diagrams as close as possible that process. The process became quite evident, and none of the other mechanisms seem to play any significant role. So again, within the error bars that you can expect in this type of analysis, I don't seem to believe that I found any case where I could unequivocally ascertain that the flame was spreading in the opposed mode, either laterally or downwards, in any significant way.
Do you agree, though, that there are some pathways laterally that it could have followed, albeit slowly?
Oh,
so,
absolutely.
for example, on the tops and the bottoms of the windows, along edges of the ACM cassettes where, for example, there may have been some exposed edges, or indeed along the window infill panels?
Yeah, I mean, once again, I go back to this issue that these are incredibly complex systems, and I would not be surprised that there will be some places in which the flames actually creep under a cavity that was horizontal. That could have possibly happened, but it was by no means a dominant mechanism.
And what about the potential contribution of the cut edges of the PIR insulation? Is it possible that that could have played a role, either because debris was falling down and by that time it was hitting that, or because it was burning along the edge?
Well, I mean, again, you go back to the same point. This is in such a level of complexity. Yes, it is possible that it played a role, but would that be considered one of the dominant factors for the lateral spread? I don't believe so.
Yeah. Now, finally, on this topic, you've explained that internationally there are some exceptions in terms of high-rise fires where the fire did propagate laterally. Can we just look at a couple of those examples? If we go to figure 25 in your report, that's JTOS 601 at page 62. So this is the Salafa Tower in Dubai, where you say the lateral flame spread extended to almost half of the building. Is that correct?
Yes.
And that's what we see in these images here. Does it remain the case that there's limited information about the construction details which could have explained that in this particular case?
Yes, I think this is one of those cases where there's very limited information. One thing that appears regularly, particularly in media descriptions of this case, is that the wind was quite significant. So you can see that the spread in one direction is much more significant than in the others. So there is a possibility that that had an effect. But again, I mean, this is an example where you can see a systematic line of lateral flame spread that is very different, to what you see in Grenfell.
Yeah. And you've also drawn attention to the Monte Carlo casino and hotel fire in 2008, where the fire spread laterally across a parapet. Can we just look at that? Figure 32, JTOS 601, page 75. So these are images of the Monte Carlo hotel and casino fire. Can you explain why you think this has particular parallels with the fire at Grenfell?
Well, I mean, I think that this particular case, the upper part of the building is a thick layer of combustible material that is rendered with a non-combustible protection. The rendering of the non-combustible protection performed very poorly So it effectively exposes the material quite rapidly. So it allows the combustible material to propagate laterally quite rapidly. Now, an interesting aspect of this one, and you can see it in Figure D, is that this material drips down and basically deposits in the edges that you can see, and that's really the mechanism that continues propagating the fire. So what you get is molten material depositing in that ledge, and that pool that forms in there is the one that keeps igniting the material forwards. So in that sense, it does show some similarities with Grenfell.
Yep. I now want to look at re-entry of the fire in stage 3, and then we might take a break in about another 10 minutes after that. So you say that your stage 3 is also marked by re-entry into flats and the interior migration of smoke and fire. You've said that the external fire generates thermal loads as high as 120 kilowatts per metre square. We discussed that earlier.
Yes.
And you've said that that level of heat flux would inevitably cause a failure of, and you've said the window glazing, the extract fans, the UPVC window surrounds, allowing flame re-entry. Is that right?
Yes.
And that flames will then ignite other combustible materials inside the compartment, causing internal fires.
Yes.
Can we just explore some of the methods of re-entry that we have seen in the evidence? In section 7.4 of his report, Professor Bisbee has drawn attention to a large number of witnesses who comment specifically on the early failure and ignition of the extract fans unit and the surrounding XPS panels. So you have the extractor fan. We looked at the kitchen window earlier. The extractor fan in the middle, it's got a panel surrounding it, which is it's extruded polystyrene. Is that correct?
Yes.
And Professor Bisbee has drawn attention to that as a potential route for ingress. You've also highlighted that mode of failure in your report. Now, many of these that Professor Bisbee has drawn attention to were in the flat 6s on the east face of the tower. Do you think that this evidence is potentially significant in terms of the route of fire spread back into apartments?
Potentially. I think that once again, when we think of the design of a window, we are designing a window keeping in mind that we don't want fire spreading from one building to another one. So we set a certain criteria, which is 12.6 kilowatts per meter square, as being the criteria that is used for the design of all the window components. So in principle, there is no expectation that any of these components will withstand anything above 12.6 kilowatts per meter square. So in principle, yes, I wouldn't be surprised that one of these elements is weaker than the others. We found quite a bit of evidence of exactly the same, as we found evidence of other mechanisms. And I would imagine that, yes, this could be potentially a significant way for the fire to get back in.
Do you think it might have been significant in terms of the timing of the ingress on that face? I.e., is it possible that during the early stages of the fire that this was a more predominant ingress path, and that perhaps, say, you get glazing failures later in the fire?
There's nothing that makes me believe that time in this particular case would have been an issue, because keep in mind that you're exposing the systems to a heat flux that is an order of magnitude bigger. So effectively, the failure times are going to be generally quite fast. So what difference could it make? From a time perspective is very difficult. I wouldn't say it would be too significant.
Professor Bisbee's also highlighted some other possible routes of ingress, and I just want to briefly ask you about some of these. Gaps in the window framing. Many residents have referred to gaps and drafts around the windows after the refurbishment, and some have actually referred to fire directly ingressing through those window surrounds. Again, do you think that may have had a role to play?
It would have had a role. I mean, clearly, if there is a gap, in as much as there could be a window open or something like that, then there will be no barrier. So that delay that you will have, from the moment the flames arrive until the smoke starts getting in. And also, early on, I mean, from the perspective of smoke migration, it could have been significant because smoke goes up and envelopes a building. So you could have areas where effectively you have no heat, but you actually have smoke. So the smoke could have easily penetrated through those gaps. So from the perspective of smoke migration, I think it might have a significant role. But from the perspective of re-entry of flames, that's probably not as significant.
Yeah. Just to be clear, I was going to come on to open windows in a moment. I was talking here about, we know the windows were pushed out during refurbishment and there were gaps down the side that were filled with insulation. And residents have talked about drafts around those gaps, or some have. Just to be clear, do you think that's a potential path of fire or smoke spread back in?
Any gap is a potential path for smoke. Yeah. Any gap, in any potential path for spread requires a condition of failure, and that condition either is the ignition of the insulation, a heat flux sufficient to break it, heat flux sufficient to melt something. Yeah. So then, because you require a condition for failure, and your heat insult is so much higher than it was designed for, then I think that's what makes the difference minor, because at those heat fluxes, everything will fail very rapidly.
We've also heard instances of the softening and the melting of the UPVC and then entry. I mean, that's a similar route. You agree that that's a...
Yes.
Yeah. You've talked about thermally induced breakage of window glazing. And then open windows. Do you think they may have played a role in terms of windows? It was a hot night, windows being open, flame spread going up. Is that...
I think more than flame spread, I think the role of windows is probably more significant in regards to smoke migration.
Yeah. It's been suggested that double glazed units are resistant to fire attack and that it's by no means certain that they will fail during a fire. Would you agree with that?
No.
Spray foam. Professor Bisbee has identified the use of spray foam to seal gaps around the windows to provide a final airtight seal. And he has considered this to be potentially significant in terms of the ingress of fire and smoke around the windows. Do you think that the presence of spray foam could have exacerbated the ingress on the night?
I mean, it would have, like everything else, but I do think, again, that this falls in that category where I would not be able to establish a ranking between all of this because they will all fail in a very short period of time.
What about whether any of the internal compartment fires themselves on the night, once they're burning, could have contributed to the external flame spread? The extent of, or the severity of the external flame spread. Is that a possibility?
No, that is actually a true fact. Clearly, if you have a fire that starts in a compartment, the compartment has a fuel load. So it has a significant amount of energy that is being released, and that energy is going to partially spill out, particularly if doors are closed. So it's going to spill out, and it is going to contribute to the energy that is being released. Now, clearly, again, the interplay between how fast is it spreading and how fast you reach conditions in which this internal fires start contributing is what really matters. But effectively, once you start releasing that energy has to go somewhere, and part of it is going to go out, and it's going to contribute to the process.
Do you think there are any times in the fire or particular aspects of the burning we see on any of the facades where you think that's happening?
There's nothing in particular. I mean, I think there's obviously certain areas like as is explained by Dr. Lane and Professor Bisbee, the areas around the 12th floor where you have particularly unusual burning, where potentially what is happening inside is having more effect on the rest. But those seem to happen generally after the fire has passed. And if they are contributing, they're contributing to the heat that is in the plume, and thus contributing to what is happening much, much further.
I'm now going to move to a separate topic, so this might be a good moment for a break.
Is that a good time?
Yes.
Well, Professor, I think we'll have a break now for 10 minutes.
Thank you.
get the usher and no talking about your evidence, please, and we'll be back at 20 past. Right, 20 past 3, please. Professor, ready to go on?
Yes.
Good, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, Ms. Grange?
Yes, just one question relating to that last topic about ingress through windows. We were talking about the fact that it may not have made much difference, given you've got 120 kilowatt per metre square fire going up vertically, that weaknesses in the window arrangement may not have made much difference in terms of ingress, given you get glazing failure anyway. What about downward flame spread? So the primary mechanism you were talking about earlier of melting and dripping debris, which then accumulates on ledges or window ledges, and then them itself creates smaller fires which go up. Is it possible in that situation that weaknesses in windows, whether it's the extract fan unit or other weaknesses around the sides, could have then played a role or a more significant role?
Yes, I think that if you have debris, then obviously you have much less insult from the fire on the external part, and weaknesses in the window design would have had a more significant impact on potential ingress of the flames.
So I now want to move to consider the internal migration of smoke and fire. And at this point, I think it's important to draw attention to your addendum to your Phase 1 report, where you've essentially highlighted that there's a need to do a lot of further work at Phase 2, specifically, say, to correlate the firefighter activity and the smoke spread during both stages 2 and 3 of the fire. Is that correct?
Yes.
Can we just go to what you've said in your addendum? So if we bring that up, that's JTOS 602 at page 1. And I just want to highlight a couple of paragraphs here. In the second main paragraph, you've said, because you have done a 999 call analysis, haven't you, of people reporting smoke in certain areas. You've said there are multiple 999 calls during stage 2, that's 105 to 130, reporting smoke in the lobbies as the fire spread vertically up the building from flat 16 on level 4 to the roof above level 23. Most of these calls centre around the middle of the building, with smoke in lobbies reported by callers on levels 10, 11, 12 and 14, time between 125 and 128. Of these reports, only level 14 is clearly reported as having a significant amount of smoke. Prior to this, there's also a report of a smoke-filled lobby higher up the building on level 22 at 121. This latter report is likely to be due to the internal spread of smoke, as the fire had not reached level 22 by this stage. So there, is it right that you're mainly highlighting what the pattern of the 999 calls was showing?
Yes.
In terms of the spread of smoke? And then you say this in your third paragraph. You say from the onset of stage 3, that's 1:30 to 2 a.m., 999 callers consistently report thick black smoke considered unpassable by residents in the lobbies. These include the 12th, 14th, 16th, 18th and 21st to 23rd level lobbies within the period 1:30 and 1:40 alone. And then you say further 999 calls for the rest of stage 3 report a similar situation on the 10th, 11th, 19th and 20th levels. Some of these also report smoke in the stairwell itself. It's clear that from the onset of stage 3, internal smoke spread is fairly ubiquitous above level 10. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, you've noticed the levels there in terms of smoke spread. Do you think there's any significance in terms of where smoke's being reported at that point in the building?
Can you extend a bit? What do you mean?
Well, you've highlighted certain parts of the building, 12th, 14th, 16th, 18th, 21st to 23rd, effectively the middle of the building and then the top of the building. Do you think that's significant in terms of the pattern of what we're seeing?
Well, it is significant in the sense that it's somehow unusual that you have concentrated calls in certain areas of the building, which clearly show you that there was something unusual that was happening in there. And we have not been able to gather the complete amount of information to be able to establish exactly what is going on.
Yeah. Yes. Now, you've highlighted some examples in your report from the available footage that we have of the tower of smoke emerging from flats on the opposite side of the tower to the fire front, the flame front on the east side. Can we just have a look at those images? But before we do, I probably ought to issue another trigger warning. So we're going to be looking at images of the tower We're just looking at smoke spread through the tower. It's not the tower on fire, but some people may find these images upsetting or distressing, and in which case they should leave now. So those images are figures 48 to 52. That's JTOS 601, starting on page 88. We can bring that up. So these are images, my understanding is on the west face of the facade.
Yes.
And we see as early as 157, 158, that there is smoke emerging. Just explain to us the top image. Where is the smoke emerging from on that image? Where are you referring to?
You can see a darker color coming.
Would you like to get up and point it out to us? That
Yes.
would be
Yeah.
helpful.
So these are the types of images that you can see.
Yep.
And
You can see it very clearly on that bottom image. On
Yeah.
the top
On the
image.
top one? Is it there?
It's hard to tell, but
No, it's there.
there'll be
Yeah.
somewhere in there.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
So this is west face. It's 1:57 2 a.m. You say that the significance of this is that that movement of smoke would only be possible if compartmentation is breached for 2 units. Is that right? So
Yes.
it's got through one flat, into the lobby, through the lobby, and into another flat.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
And why did you think that it was so important to highlight that?
Because the conditions are such that the doors themselves would have not failed. The flats on the west facade were not on fire yet. So that clearly tells you that the doors had to be open, as opposed to the doors having failed because of an event.
Because what you're saying is there's no flame front there
Yes.
on the west face to cause a flame-induced failure of the
Yeah.
doors. So you're deducing from that that it must have been smoke spreading through an open door
Yes.
that was left open by a fleeing occupant.
Well, that could potentially be the case. It could potentially be firefighting intervention. These are the kinds of things that I think before any conclusions are drawn, we have to be very, very careful that all the available information is correlated.
There's also some factual evidence that firefighters found considerable smoke in certain lobbies very early on in the fire. For example, firefighter Auberne, who goes up and finds smoke in the lobbies as early as 1:20 in some areas. You're aware of that?
Yes.
In the light of that and your analysis of the 999 calls that you've done, and I realise this is only a preliminary analysis, do you agree that the lobbies appear to have been compromised on a number of floors very early in the fire, for example, by 1:20 and certainly by 1:25, 1:26?
Yes, I mean, there is sufficient evidence to say that there was a level of compromising of the lobbies quite early on. I think it's really not 100% certain to me the exact timings, because it's not always, we don't always have exactly the times, for example, when the firefighters were in different places.
Yeah. And-
Is it possible that that was the result of what we've called the flat sixes being exposed to fire and therefore smoke, and then people leaving the flat sixes and the doors not being closed?
Yes, absolutely.
Because that would compromise the lobby in each case. wouldn't it?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think that is a possibility, and that will imply that the self-closing mechanisms were not working, and that people didn't close the doors. So I think that clearly that is a possibility that needs to be evaluated very carefully.
And is that the kind of detailed work you'd want to do at phase 2, which is
Yes.
to try and look very specifically about occupant egress, door condition, firefighter activity, floor by floor, flat by flat,
Yes.
to try and piece it together?
So you can make a correlation to gain certainty on all the timings, and in particular, the level at which they had been compromised by smoke.
Yeah. Now, given that you have said you want to do much more detailed work at phase 2, at this stage what I'm proposing to do is just explore some of the broad themes that you have identified in your report, which are potentially important in terms of internal smoke spread. But just before we get to that, it's right to note, isn't it, that you've emphasised, again, the importance of maintaining these internal compartmentation lines of defence.
Yes.
And you've said that internal smoke spread, particularly into the lobbies and stairwells, correlates strongly with past fire events that do result in a high number of casualties. Is that right?
Yes.
So, in contrast, some very large international fires with comparable internal fire spread have not resulted in penetration of smoke and flames into the lobby or stairs. Is that right?
Yes.
And I know it's very difficult in general terms, but can you give us an indication of why in those events it didn't penetrate into the lobby and the stairs? What was it about those buildings that were potentially different to what we saw at Grenfell?
Well, I mean, I think in many of these cases, it was the layout of the building. And for example, the case of the address, one of the main structural walls of the building basically separates the apartments from the corridor. So you have a very significant compartmentalization barrier in there. Clearly, a big issue is obviously the doors, and not in the sense of the doors withstanding the event, but more in the case of the doors being left open or closed. So the quality of the maintenance of the building is clearly appropriate. Some of these fires happen in buildings that were fairly new, so they had not been damaged. So things like self-closers were probably all working appropriately. So in general, conceptually, it's very simple in the sense that it is about keeping the barrier in place. And that's the quality of the barrier in itself and the quality of the doors and their capability of self-closing.
And is it therefore right to assume that the compartmentation separating each flat from the neighbouring flats should be capable of resisting any significant passage of smoke, heat and fire from one flat to another?
Yes.
And that's the case even in the event of a very significant external facade fire?
Eventually, you might end up having a problem, but the compartmentalization in principle should be designed to a level in which it withstands the fire for a very significant period of time. And compartmentalization, as I said, is designed on the basis of a post-flashover fire. So you already have the time that it takes for the fire to enter, the time that it takes for the fire to transition to flashover, and then the time that you have for the failure of the compartmentalization under those conditions. So you have all these significant delays that in principle should allow people to migrate to the lobby and then from the lobby to the stairs. So you have already 2 layers of compartmentalization that you have to breach. So in principle, compartmentalization is a very robust way of giving a very significant amount of time for people to enter the stairs and be safe in the stairs for an even longer period of time.
Yeah. Now, moving to some themes that we can pick up, and I just want to discuss door failure by fire for a moment. We'll come to penetration of smoke in a moment, but concentrating on door failure by fire, you've noted that the flat doors that were removed from the building when tested, or one of those exemplar flat doors was tested, demonstrated 15 minutes integrity when it was tested by the BRE on behalf of the Metropolitan Police. That's right, isn't it? And is it right to note that that's a test with a 740 degrees C failure temperature?
Yes.
Is that right? Which is above flashover temperature, is that
Yes.
right? So flashover temperature is about 500, 600 degrees.
Yes.
Is that correct? So does it remain your view that the failure of the doors by fire is most likely to occur in cases where flashover is reached?
Yes.
And where flashover is not reached, it's unlikely the door is going to fail due to internal fire?
Yes.
You've highlighted in your report that despite major damage in many of the flats, a significant number did not attain flashover. You also say in your addendum report that fire-induced door failure could be a contributing factor in the latter part of stage 3.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
But you don't think it's going to be a significant contributing factor during stage 2 or earlier, is that right?
Yes.
And does that remain your view?
That remains my view.
Let's turn then to penetration of flat doors by smoke. We know from Dr. Lane's report that there are a number of difficulties with many of the flat doors, including that they don't comply with relevant cold smoke leakage requirements and an absence of test evidence which correlates with those doors. Is it your view, based on what you've seen and the general themes emerging, that the doors fail to maintain compartmentation in terms of smoke spread?
Yes, that's possible.
You have noted yourself in your report reports of smoke coming through flat doors, for example, at 125 and 126, just based on the 999 calls.
Yes.
What do you think is the significance of that in that early stage?
Again, it goes back to the problem of multiple breaches of compartmentalization. So if there's a call that indicates that smoke is coming into that flat through the door, that basically means that the flat is not on fire, and the smoke is coming through the lobby, and that must have come through from another apartment. So effectively, you have again this path where you have multiple levels of failure before it starts entering the apartment. So I think this needs to be explored in very significant detail, because given the long period of time that people spend in those spaces, it is fundamental to try to understand what were those breaches.
Yeah, I was just going to draw attention to that obviously it's right, isn't it? Any door will fail after a certain amount of time, or may fail after a certain amount of time. But here, it may have been very significant for those that were trapped in flats that there was smoke spread coming through the doors.
Yes.
In terms of their ability to survive in those flats and then or potentially be rescued. Is that
Yes,
correct?
That's correct.
It's fair to mention there are some instances of doors apparently performing slightly better on the night. So take Antonio Roncolato, who's there until 6 in the morning, potentially Natasha Elcock, another example, some examples of it performing more effectively. What do you think is the potential significance of that in terms of the overall pattern that we're seeing, or is it too early to say?
Well, I think it is actually very difficult, to ascertain, because clearly we, in theory, should be operating under the assumption that the doors are all homogeneous, and therefore every flat should have been designed in fairly similar manner, and it should have been maintained and kept, and that generally is not the case. And what we get is significant variance in the level of maintenance, in the care that these things are given, even the way in which they're designed or built. So variations are expected, both in the use and in the construction. So I believe that is probably one of the main reasons why you find some differences in what people observe.
Occupant egress, you also have discussed, and you've already mentioned it a number of times, the effect of occupant egress on compartmentation. Does it remain your view that that would have a negligible effect unless the doors are not closed behind people when they leave? Is that right?
Yes.
So you think just the opening and closing of a flat door onto a lobby is unlikely to affect the overall pattern of smoke spread significantly? Is that right?
Yes, I think that if you think of the process of egress, if people are evacuating, that basically means that the smoke that they are exposed to within their apartment is still not the type of smoke that will threaten their lives. So whatever is coming into the lobby of people evacuating their own apartments will be very far from tenability. And so I would not expect that that will have a significant impact on the lobby itself. Now, if the door is left open, then there will be a significant delay under which conditions can actually change, and then you can actually have a different kind of smoke entering the lobby area.
Yeah, so if those door closers are ineffective or not installed, is it your position that the contribution to the spread of smoke is going to be greater? by definition.
Much more significant, yes.
And is it also going to be significant in terms of the oxygen potentially getting into those flats and the fires you have in those flats?
Yes, although I will believe that in a scenario like this one will be a secondary effect. I mean, clearly when you have a post-flashover fire is considered to be an underventilated fire. So the more oxygen you put in, the more intense it burns. But in this particular case, given that the fire is coming from the outside and you have window breakage and so forth, probably the impact will be secondary. But yes, of course, it will add some more air into the fire.
Well, imagine you're fleeing a flat 6 and you've seen your kitchen window on fire and potentially your kitchen starting to burn. You flee out the door and the closer doesn't shut behind you. Is that compartment likely to come to flash over quicker because you've left the door open?
No, actually it will be the opposite.
The
It will
opposite.
not, yes, because you're going to be losing smoke.
Yep.
So effectively that will delay the transition to flashover.
But there will be an easy transmission of smoke from the flat into the lobby.
Into the lobby. And then once the flat transitions to flashover, you have a better ventilation on the flat, so the fire will be more intense.
Yeah. So both Dr. Lane and Professor Bisbee have emphasised a significant body of evidence which suggests that many of the door closers were not effective on the night. And Professor Bisbee has emphasised a number of flat 6s on the east face where this may have been the case. Have you formed any views at this stage as to how significant you think that might have been in terms of the overall compromise of the lobbies with smoke?
Yeah. I mean, that is a very difficult question to answer, because I think obviously if the door doesn't close, the effect on compromising the lobbies is very, very significant. Now, unfortunately, self-closing mechanisms are not necessarily the most reliable, of systems. Just to give you a very simple example, the door between the witness room and the coffee room, somebody has removed the self-closing mechanism. And this is done regularly, and because effectively it creates self-closing mechanisms tend to disturb our usual way of using living environments. So I think having an enormous reliance of self-closing mechanisms is probably asking too much of a system that is a very secondary means of protection. In principle, if the fire would have not emerged from the compartment of origin, it would have remained compartmentalized, then all these secondary elements are just extra redundancies that we're putting in place that are not truly significant to the fire safety strategy. Now, the problem is that when everything else fails, then these are the only things that can pick up the pieces, and then they acquire a significance that they were never intended to have.
Yeah. I mean, are there other options to door closes?
No, we should have them,
Yeah.
and under the expectation that there will be a very significant rate of failure.
Yeah.
That's why it becomes, sort of an ultimate redundancy and not a primary means of protection.
But the door is the one, as it were, weak link in the whole compartmentation design, isn't it? Because in a building like Grenfell, forget the cladding for a minute, the rest is concrete.
Yes.
So I would have thought that to have effective self-closers on the doors was pretty much critical to the concept of compartmentation.
It is in a certain sense. Okay, so effectively, if the compartment fails, okay, and people evacuate and leave the door, you would have compromised the lobby. Yeah. But then you have, from the lobby to the door of the stair, you have another fire resistance door. Yeah. So you're putting multiple layers of protection to try to make sure that one picks it up. Now, if the fire remains within the unit and it compromises the lobby, then you have a smoke extraction system that will try to clear that up. But the people that are staying in the other flats will be protected by their own compartmentalization. So in principle, yes, you're putting all these elements, and because we recognize that the door is the weakest link in compartmentalization, this is why we put the self-closing mechanisms. But we have to also recognize that these are not systems that are generally maintained at a level that we have an absolute guarantee that they're going to work.
Yes.
Does it follow then that actually the stair door is of really fundamental, critical importance
Absolutely.
in terms of protecting your egress route.
Yes. And you would imagine that then being the stair door, a public space of the building, the maintenance level of those self-closing mechanisms will be of a much higher quality than what you would expect could happen in the interior of a flat.
Yeah, and because it's a firefighting shaft, it has to have a higher rating
and
etc.,
so forth.
and all of that. We're going to explore all of that with Dr. Lane on
Yes.
Thursday. Yeah. Another topic is firefighter activity. You've highlighted this, including running hoses through stairwell doors, or breaking down flat doors. For example, the breaking down of the flat 16 door. In terms of the significance of this, what you say is that this is arguably less significant if you're just fighting a one-fire floor. It's kind of what you just said.
Yes.
But that becomes really problematic once you've got multiple floors on fire, if you have doors held open, particularly to the stairs. Is that correct?
Absolutely, because effectively, if the fire remains within the compartment, the stay-put strategy stands, and therefore people are not required to evacuate the building. So the stair, in a way, will not be used until the firefighters establish or deem that the stair can be used again. And so during their operations, the possibility of filling the stair with smoke is real. And it is part of the concept of a stay-put strategy. So in that sense, it is not a very significant problem. But if you have multiple floor fires, then you have to evacuate people while they are operating. There's a convergence of timescales.
Yeah.
And then their operations become in conflict,
Yeah.
with the actions of the occupants of the building.
So I think you also make this point, which is it prevents a change of strategy from stay put to evacuation if you've already compromised your evacuation route.
Exactly, makes it much more difficult to take the decision of moving from one strategy to another.
And have you formed any preliminary views about how significant the holding open of doors or the battering down of doors might have been in explaining the early egress of smoke onto lobbies or compromise of egress routes?
From the preliminary information that we have, it seems that the evolution of the conditions of the stairs and in some cases the lobbies is very dynamic. So I think that this opening and closing of doors and so forth seems to be a very significant aspect of the problem.
Yeah. Missing or damaged fire stopping. Here you've relied on the assessment by Dr. Lane. Does it remain of your view that there are only minor weaknesses in, for example, the stair enclosure in terms of compartmentation? Have you seen anything that would suggest that there were any penetrations that were causing issue with compartmentation?
I think that's correct.
Yeah. Ingress as a result of the smoke control system and the vents onto the lobbies. Have you had a chance to consider Appendix J of Dr. Lane's
Yes,
report and her concerns based on some of the factual evidence that we've heard about the possible passage of smoke via the vents, the dampers in the smoke control system between lobbies? Do you have any views about the potential significance of that at this stage, or is that something you'd like to do further work on?
Well, as Dr. Lane indicates at the beginning of Appendix J, the system was designed for a one-floor fire. So while there's a number of non-compliances that she highlights in the appendix, it is clear to me that a system that was designed for a one-floor fire, in particular when we're talking about vertical shafts, fans and dampers, it is very clear that its performance is completely unreliable. So whether it was properly designed or improperly designed, I would have absolutely it would not surprise me at all that the system didn't perform at all.
But does it concern you that we have factual evidence where people are reporting smoke coming through those vents straight into the lobbies? Is that concerning?
Well, the evidence is that the system is performing poorly because it's bringing smoke into the lobbies. Now, that could have been because of the non-compliances, but it could also have been because the system was designed to basically deal with one floor. One of the things that is not clear yet from Appendix A, and I think it should be explored a bit more in detail, was the way in which the dampers were activated. Because effectively the detection of smoke within a lobby will activate the dampers for that specific floor. But what was the algorithm supposed to do if you had smoke in 10 different floors.
Yeah.
So the way in which the system is operating, smoke management systems are a very precise balance of pressures, where you effectively have to push the smoke in one direction so that you clear another space without necessarily altering what is happening in a fire. So many times when you change the equilibrium of the systems, smoke might end up going in all the wrong directions. So I think that there is a reason for concern, and there's a reason to look into that space. But I think we have to keep in mind that it was a system that was designed for a one-floor fire, and that is the fundamental weakness of the system, not necessarily the non-compliances.
Yeah. In general at this stage, before we move to your untenable stage 4, in general, do you have any more developed views about smoke migration in the light of the phase 1 evidence, or is that something you want to go away and look at in more detail?
Yeah, I think I'd rather not comment any further, because I do think that requires a bit more detailed analysis.
So your stage 4 you describe as the untenable stage, and you say this is from 2:30 a.m. until extinction of the fire, and this marks significantly untenable conditions in the fire. Can you just be clear what you mean by untenable here?
Yeah, and untenability is a very complex concept to define, because it is partially perception and partially reality. An individual that walks into smoke might encounter conditions that will not allow him to survive or her to survive. So in principle, that is the definition of untenability. So it's when the concentrations of carbon monoxide, of toxics, or even visibility are such that it disables the individual and eventually leads to its death. And but there's another concept associated to tenability, which is purely the perception of the individual. Sometimes the conditions might not be such that they threaten the life to the person, but the fact that they see dense smoke bellowing from some door is sufficient to deter somebody from crossing a stair or crossing a lobby, and they will return back and turn around. So that could also be perceived as a condition of tenability. So in this particular case, I think at this stage, when I refer to tenability, I refer to both, because effectively there's a number of instances where people will see the smoke and decide that they couldn't go through without really recognizing that they could have potentially go through. Mm-hmm. And other people that might have chosen to go through, they might have actually managed to get out. So there's a little bit of variability in there that then is highlighted by Dr. Purser's report afterwards. But I think that's what I refer to as tenability, is basically both conditions that are actually harmful to the individual, but also conditions that the individual perceives as harmful and therefore changes his actions because of them.
And linked to that, can you explain the capacity of some residents to succeed in self-evacuations after 3 a.m.? I mean, we've got numerous examples of people who were able to get out after 3 a.m. down those stairs.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of both. Is people that actually made a better choice, in the sense that despite perceiving that the conditions were dangerous, they probably just simply took the decision of moving through. But also there is a component, and it's quite clear from the 999 calls, the system is very dynamic. So there are moments where effectively the stairs seem to clear up more than other moments. So I think they might just simply got the right window. So I think it's a combination of both, very difficult to ascertain. But I think if we can manage to pinpoint the way in which smoke is migrating, then we will be able to at least establish which are the conditions that were acceptable, which ones were not, so that then we can ascertain more or less what was the interaction of the people with with the smoke. So
just to be clear, you think on the evidence you've seen at the moment that there probably was real variability in the conditions of the stairs over time.
Yes.
In this phase.
Yes, clearly.
Yeah. And in terms of the hot spot or hot zone that Dr. Lane identified in her report between levels 13 to 16, where we saw, for example, the stair lights had really completely melted, in contrast to other lights further up, higher up the tower, where
Yes.
they were still intact. She suggested in her most recent report that this may have been due most likely to firefighter activity, possibly because of the holding open of doors at or near these levels and the migration of very hot smoke and gases into the stair at that point. Is that consistent with your reading of the evidence so far in terms of what might explain this hot zone?
Yes, that's perfectly possible, and I do think that a little bit more detail is necessary in ascertaining the timing of the firefighting actions, particularly the timing. But I do think that that form of behavior is not conventional behavior in a stair. Having a hot zone requires having hot gases entering, but at the same time exiting, because the heat doesn't carry over. It just stops after a certain region. So it does require quite an unusual pattern of behavior that needs to be really carefully looked at, and it could potentially be associated to firefighter activity.
Could it be to do with multiple doors being held open at different levels and thereby allowing the passage of smoke and then an exiting of the passage of smoke?
It is most likely necessary that there will be multiple doors open at the same time.
Yeah. Just finally, in terms of there was a refuse chute door off the lobbies with a refuse chute down with doors onto it, and those refuse chutes, is it right, that were relatively undamaged?
Yes.
Do you think those could have been some kind of refuge in this fire?
My attitude towards this type of thing is that if you design a place to be a refuge, then that place shall be treated as such. In this particular case, we designed the stair to be such, and the stair failed.
Yeah.
And so there is no guarantee that any of these spaces could have been an appropriate refuge for people.
Professor Torero, so that's the end of my questions,
Yes.
but the convention is now that we just pause
Sure.
and have a short break to see if there are any more questions that I need to absorb.
Okay.
So if we can
would
just...
normally have 5 minutes. Do you want a bit longer?
Depends on what the people to my left are
I know.
planning. It may be... I mean, we've got the time,
Well,
so can we have 10
I'll
minutes?
say 10 past
yes,
4. Shall I?
thanks.
Right, we'll have a break for 10 minutes. I'd like to go to the usher, please. Right. 10 past 4 then, please. think, a few questions still. Yes,
Not
that's
many,
great.
no,
Not many.
thankfully.
Oh, yeah.
Just two topics, really. First, the stair doors and then the roof. So on the stair doors, I take it you're aware of Dr. Lane's more detailed investigation into the stair doors and the fact that they may have actually been as low as 20 minutes integrity fire resistance. Is that correct?
Yes.
Do you agree with Dr. Lane that the stair doors being held open or being jammed open, for example, by firefighter equipment or other objects, appears to be the primary reason for the failure to maintain compartmentation as between the lobby and the stairs?
Well, that would be whatever the reason was why they were left open. If the doors were open, that would have been the primary mechanism by which the stairs would have been compromised.
As opposed to any issue about the integrity of those doors?
As I explained for the doors of the flats, the temperature at 20 minutes would have been of the order of 800 and something degrees. So the lobby would have already had to be at about 800 degrees and for the doors to fail. So if the doors were not at the best of their capabilities, it would have still taken a lot, to make them fail. So I think opening of the doors is clearly a much more viable mechanism.
Do you think any issues about the integrity of those doors are insignificant, or do you think that they still have a role?
When we're talking about compartmentation, and again, we've discussed this issue that it is how you gain robustness to the system, and the moment the doors are not of the desired quality, clearly you're losing robustness to your system. And the problem with having poor quality doors is that their modes of failure are not necessarily only because of heat. They might sometimes not be placed appropriately, and so they might introduce leaks. There's numerous other mechanisms by which the doors, a poor quality door can actually affect the performance of compartmentation.
Yeah. And just finally, one question about the roof. Based on what you know, had people been able to access the roof, do you think that could have provided a kind of safe space, a safe refuge?
There is no evidence that evacuation through the roof or the roof as a safe haven can actually be appropriate. I think there's been numerous incidents, and there's been many people thinking of ways by which you can gain the benefit of being outside, but it is something that should not be promoted, because there is no evidence that the roof represents a safe space for people.
Okay, those are all my questions. Thank you.
Right.
I'd just like to say thank you very much, Professor Torero. I know you have put a huge amount of work into your Phase 1 report, and I'm sure a huge amount of work is going to go into your Phase 2 report as well, and we are extremely grateful for your time and your commitment to this inquiry. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'd like to endorse that. We're really grateful to you for putting your undoubted expertise at the disposal of the inquiry. You've produced a very full and comprehensive report for us already, for which we're very grateful, and now you've explained certain aspects of it today. So it's been extremely useful and, may I say, very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
So yes, it's Professor Bisbee tomorrow at 10, and Mr. Millett will be taking him.
Right, thank you very much. Well, that's it for today. We'll break at this point. We'll resume tomorrow at 10 o'clock. Thank you all very much.